for joining me to learn more about the topic of disproportionality. My name is Renee Aziz. I'm a National Professional Development Trainer and CEO of Virtuoso Education Consulting. The disproportionate representation of students, usually minority students, in special education continues to be an important topic among educators nationally. Now, as we discuss the topic of disproportionality in this very short video, I'd like to do three things. I'd like to define for you what exactly we mean by disproportionality. I'd like to discuss the ways in which disproportionality is commonly measured. And lastly, I'd like to highlight what the research says about contributing factors in disproportionality. So let's begin with a common definition. Disproportionality is defined as the representation of a group in a category that does not meet our expectations for that group or differs substantially from the representation of others in that category. Now, disproportionality can either refer to overrepresentation, by that we mean more than what we expect, or underrepresentation, less than what we expect, of a specific group in whatever category we're looking at. Now, federal law requires that disproportionality in special education be monitored and reported annually. So oftentimes when we talk about disproportionality, we're really talking about it under the umbrella of special education. Now, there are three common ways in which disproportionality is measured. The first way is through what we call a composition index, and this is really the most basic way of measuring disproportionality. And by composition index, we mean that we're looking at the percentage of students in a particular category from a specific subgroup. So, for example, if let's say we're looking at overall school enrollment, and when we look at our school enrollment, we notice that females, girls, represent 250 out of 500 of our total students. Right? Now, using a composition index, we would take that 250 and divide it by 500, and we say that 50% of our student enrollment is represented by females, right? Now, the basic calculation of a composition index addresses the question of, are there more students from a given group represented in a specific category than what we'd expect given their proportion in the population? So now, back to our example, if we know that girls make up 50% of our overall student body, what would happen if we use the composition index to look at a specific grade level? If we chose to look at a specific grade level and then we noticed that females represented 75% of students at that grade level, we could say that the composition index for females at that specific grade level is disproportionate given their overall enrollment of 50% in our school-wide enrollment numbers. The second way of calculating disproportionality is what we call using a risk index. The risk index calculates the percentage of a specific subgroup placed in a particular category. Now, I said that oftentimes we talk about disproportionality, we're talking about it as it relates to special education. So let me give you an example of how we use a risk index under the special education categories. So let's say a school district has a total of 1,000 African American students, and 100 of those 1,000 African American students receive special education services for, let's say, a specific learning disability. If we're looking at a risk index, we would say that the risk of any African American student in our district receiving special education services for a specific learning disability would be 10 out of that 1,000, or 10%. Again, this metric addresses the question of what is the risk that students from a specific group will be served in a specific category, in our example, special education, as an SLD or specific learning disabled student. Finally, the third most commonly used measure for calculating disproportionality is called the relative risk index. And this is the comparison of the risk or odds of placement for one group to the risk or odds of placement of another group in any category. Let's stick with our example of special education for a moment. if the risk for African American students in SLD, as we said before, was 10%, but the risk for all other students being labeled as specific learning disabled is 5%, we could say that African Americans then are 2 times more likely to be identified as SLD than any other student. Now, proportionality or equal risk would be the numeric value of 1. And while there's no federal definition at this point about the magnitude of difference required in order to say that's disproportionality, just numerically speaking, anything differing from that 1, whether it be under representation or over representation, can in essence be defined as disproportionate than what we would expect. Now, in most states, districts are asked to begin some type of remediation when the relative risk index is above that 2.0 mark. So in our example of African American students having a risk 2 times more likely than any other student and being labeled SLD, that district may very well be asked to look closer at why African American students have a higher risk for eligibility in that category. Again, the relative risk index addresses the question of how much more or how much less likely are students from any given group, oftentimes racial or ethnic category, how much more or less likely are those students than any other student to be identified in a specific category. Using those 3 measures, the composition index, the risk index, and then the relative risk index, you can observe patterns not only in special education categories, but also in disciplinary practices like suspensions and expulsions, enrollment in gifted programs, and of course, your most basic proficiency measures, like how proficient are students across different categories in meeting our grade level expectations or standards. Using a combination of those 3 measures is really an essential first step in developing a plan of action for school improvement. And as in all other aspects of school improvement, you must let the data drive your decision making. So by understanding the magnitude of disproportionality in your district, you'll be able to write a more targeted plan of action. Once you clearly understand the data around disproportionate representation, the next step is to determine what to do about it. It's most important to understand that there is no one overriding cause of disproportionate representation that we see in racial and ethnic disparities. Or even school discipline for that matter. Rather, our best knowledge suggests that there are really a number of factors that contribute to disproportionality. Some of those factors that have been addressed most prominently in the research are around the influence of poverty, test bias. Is there something about our tests that's not culturally responsive to all the students that we're evaluating? Unequal education opportunities or school resource factors. Also, we consider factors that are specific to the special education eligibility process and how students even get referred to that process. Another factor that is often talked about in the literature is the issue of classroom behavior management or office processing practices. And when we start looking at disproportionality around suspensions and expulsions, this factor really is discussed greatly. And the final area that is really serves as a hypothesis for why disproportionality occurs is the issue of cultural mismatch. Is there something about the culture of school and our expectations that may differ from students who we find to be disproportionately represented in whatever category we're looking at? And while all of those factors should really be considered as you determine potential causes in your district for the disproportionality that you see, I really want to caution you not to immediately use poverty as a factor of causation alone. Now, family and community poverty have been shown to create educational disadvantage, and poverty, as we know, affects students of color at disproportionate rates, right? But poverty does not fully explain the racial and the ethnic disparities in either special education or school discipline. race contributes independently and above poverty. So as I travel a lot, I hear people really focusing on the issue of poverty, and I encourage you to really be purposeful in thinking about the role that poverty plays, but also make sure that you take an in-depth look at issues really around cultural mismatch that aren't often talked about in your schools, are not often talked about in our schools, but really are very important factors. Finally, a common concern that I hear as I work with special educators across the country is that they believe disproportionality exists because students kind of move into the district with the eligibility label already. But let us remember that there's no mandate in our states that we cannot reevaluate students, right? We have the flexibility to do that when they enter our schools. And this really may be necessary in order to ensure that students are appropriately labeled and really receiving the types of supports that they require. And finally, as you consider the most relevant factors related to disproportionality in your district, it will be important for you to take action. And in my work with districts across the country, we have found that successful districts take some real important steps. First, they are able to form a team of multidisciplinary stakeholders to review the data all the time. They're focused on data and letting that drive their decision making. They also determine areas that appear to be the most relevant to the patterns of disproportionality that they see, and they collect both qualitative focus groups, talking to families, community, students, teachers, and quantitative data, right? The data that we can measure. And they use both those qualitative and quantitative data measures to support whatever hypotheses they have about why disproportionality is occurring. And thirdly, they develop and implement a plan of action with very objective and measurable goals. And then they make ongoing adaptations as the data indicates they should. So I've just given you a real quick overview outlining some of the definitions and factors to consider when attempting to develop plans to remediate patterns of disproportionate representation, but there is so much more to share about this topic. So please visit our website. It's www.virtuosoed.com. There we've got lots of resources and professional development opportunities that you'll find that will meet your needs. So thank you for watching, and we wish you much success.